I'm Henry Rosen, Associate Chair of the Department of Medicine, and a member of the Molecular Medicine program that helps to bring this series. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Scott Weigle, who is a professor of medicine and in the Division of Endocrinology. Scott came to the University of Washington in the mid-1980s and hotly pursued the study of hormones that at that point were not really quite discovered or understood that helped to regulate body weight, at that time in mice, but also some in us. And Scott's interest in feeding and obesity has continued with both laboratory studies and patient-centered studies on the impact of obesity in our health and what kinds of things happen to help make us obese. He's a superb teacher and teaches not only medical students but undergraduate students at the University of Washington in physiology, and it's always a delight to hear what he has to say.
I hope that's for Henry, not for me. No, thanks very much, Henry. That's a wonderful introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always fun to talk to interested folks, and you have to be interested to come here and give up some of your evening to listen to this. And it's particularly good to see some of my former and current students, all of whom, I will point out, are well above average. And so, hi guys, thanks for coming. It's great to talk about obesity, one of my favorite subjects. It's not so great to talk around dinner time or lunchtime. And that's because the typical heavy American meal makes people really sleepy. And I remember once giving a lecture to some students, and up on the third row there's this guy who was looking sleepier and sleepier and kind of nodding off. Finally, he just went to sleep and let out this enormous snore. And it totally took everybody by surprise, just shocked everybody, brought everything to a standstill. So I know that because we're talking about obesity, everybody got ready for this with a dinner of lentils and bean sprouts, right? No Big Macs out there. So you guys can't fall asleep, and I'm going to be specifically watching in the third row there. And if I see anybody getting sleepy, I'll throw something at you. So anyway, here's the title, The Plague of the 21st Century. And I don't think I'll have too much trouble convincing you folks that the obesity epidemic has certain resemblance to a plague, if not the plague, the Black Death of the Middle Ages caused by Yersinia pestis. And I guess the first quality of any good plague is that it should be growing explosively. And it's very easy to see how quickly obesity is starting to take over this country by referring to the Centers for Disease Control project, which charts all the important emerging diseases year by year and state by state. And this particular set of maps I'm going to show you shows the prevalence of obesity in this color-coded chart around the United States in 3-year intervals from 1990 to 2005. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, obesity is actually defined as body mass index. That's your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And you're considered obese if that number's above 30, and overweight if it's between 25 and 30. And that's a nice number because it's independent of gender, but it's a little hard to keep that in your mind. So just for example, if you're 6 feet tall, you technically become obese when you weigh 221 pounds. And if you're 5 feet 6, the cutoff point for obesity is 186 pounds. So that's the definition used by the CDC and pretty much used universally. And if you start in 1990, you'll see that, hey, we look pretty good. There are not too many states, in fact, no states here charted with obesity 15% or above of the population. But look what happens now as we get a little further. Had to bring in another category here of obesity. 15 to 19%. You can see the country getting darker and darker. Had to come up with yet another category, states over 20% obese. It gets worse, 25%, worse still, greater than 30%. And I guess the reason I don't have the 2008 numbers is they're too shocking, and I couldn't bear to show them to you. But the bottom line is that this is a growing problem, and this is just obesity. Remember, if you include overweight in that too, you can pretty much double these numbers. So at least in terms of the rate at which the problem is growing, I think you can make a fairly good analogy between obesity and a plague. But for those of you who don't particularly like to think in terms of statistics and maps and so forth, I have something to share that might make this a little more close to home. And you can ask the question, how much energy is actually stored in the excessive body fat of the American population? And this is a pretty interesting little paragraph here that I pulled from an article that's actually quite old now. And so if it was this bad in 1975, just think how bad it is now. So this is a quote from the American Journal of Public Health. In 1975, there were 146.8 million people in the United States in the 18 to 79 year age range. Using the NHANES information, we calculate 377 million kilograms of excess fat in men and 667 million kilograms in women. This sums to a total adult overweight in the U.S. of 2.3 billion pounds. So, I hope you did have lentils and bean sprouts tonight. If the caloric intake were decreased to reach and maintain ideal body fatness, the energy savings would be the equivalent of 1.3 billion gallons of gasoline, or 96.7 trillion BTU each year. This annual energy savings would more than supply the annual residential electrical demands of Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. And this was 1975. So now you can probably throw in Los Angeles, Tokyo, another couple of big cities. And it's really true that we sock a lot of energy around with us in the form of body fat. And not only is that bad for us health-wise, it's bad for us as a planet because, to produce all that extra energy, which we're carrying around, you've got to have some input into it. And one of the figures that a lot of public health people are really starting to look at now is what's called the virtual water content of items. For example, a cotton t-shirt has a virtual water content of 200 liters, meaning to grow all that cotton and turn it into a t-shirt, you've got to spread a lot of water over your cotton field. And if you look at food that we eat, the virtual water content of a typical potato is 25 liters, glass of milk, 200 liters, and a typical hamburger, 2,400 liters. So that's a lot of water to supply this huge energy demand that we're carrying around as body fat. So the other characteristic of a plague is that it's bad for your health. And I don't think there can be any argument that obesity causes problems for us. First of all, it leads to premature death through coronary artery disease typically. But even short of killing you, it does some bad things to you. The incidence of hypertension and stroke is higher in obese individuals. Diabetes, there's basically a diabetes epidemic paralleling the obesity epidemic, and that in turn leads to an epidemic of renal failure. And my wife, who works in a dialysis unit, is just seeing all these new patients coming in, week by week, and it's not clear how we're going to deal with all these folks in the future. Arthritis, sleep apnea, and then something that doesn't get captured quite as easily in the statistics is there are a lot of psychological consequences to being obese in terms of the impact it has on your self-esteem and the related depression that it can cause. And then finally, if obesity is a plague, you might expect that it's doing something to our life expectancy. And one of the marvelous benefits of our sophistication in medicine and health and drug development is that progressively, since the early 1900s, our life expectancy has been increasing year by year. And there are a few blips in that trend. For example, the 1918 flu pandemic, which hopefully isn't going to be recreated now. But aside from things like that are rather catastrophic. Life expectancy has just been going up over the past century. But this is a very provocative article that came out in the New England Journal 4 years ago, in which the authors used a number of statistical methods and projections and actually came up with the estimate, and it is just an estimate, that for the first time in roughly 75 years, we might see either a decline in life expectancy or a failure of life expectancy to increase. So I think by just about any criteria you might want to look at, you can consider obesity to be very bad for your health and public health as well, and calling it a plague I don't think is too much of a stretch. So, how do we understand obesity? Well, the first thing we have to talk about is body weight regulation. And you might say, wait a minute, who says body weight is regulated? You know, what's the evidence that body weight is regulated? And really, for most of the 20th century, there was quite a debate. You know, is your body weight really under your control? Is it a product of your willpower, what you want to look like, how close you live to the fast food restaurant in your neighborhood? And there wasn't a lot of evidence until scientists really started putting their heads together on this, that body weight is actually regulated, or to be more precise, body fat content is regulated. And I want to go through some of those studies just to set the background for the more molecular things we're going to talk about. And I think as you look back over the past, really almost 100 years now, 3 major studies stand out as sort of seminal in establishing this observation that body weight is regulated. The first of these, or actually the first 2, have to do with experiments in which humans were underfed. Energy was taken away from their diet. And the very earliest, done by Benedict in 1919, and we still use equations created by Dr. Benedict to predict energy expenditure. The first systematic study of this involved literally putting human beings in these giant thermos bottles. They actually go by the name of direct calorimeters, but if you want to figure out how much energy a person is expending, the most direct way to do it is put them in a giant insulated thermos bottle and then slowly pump some water through the jacket of the thermos bottle and measure the change in temperature as the water goes through the system. That's called direct calorimetry. And the question that Dr. Benedict asked is, what happens to your energy expenditure if we start to make you lose weight? Okay, and he got a very clear answer that's been reproduced in pretty much every study that's looked at it in the following, 70, 80 years. And what he did is shown here. So if you look at the bottom graph here, this is the energy intake that this human volunteer was fed, expressed in terms of megajoules, which is about 4 times as much as a kilocalorie. And at the baseline, this particular volunteer is being fed about, 1,400 megajoules, which would be something on the order of 3,000 calories. And he came in weighing this much, a body weight of 68 kilograms. And when they put him in the big thermos bottle, this was his heat production or energy expenditure. So what the experimenters did then is they started restricting this guy's energy intake. They basically put him on a weight-reducing diet, and sure enough, his body weight came down. And the important observation here is that as his body weight came down, his heat production came down as well. So basically, he's expending less energy, which matches the fact that he's taking less energy in. And you can see that this is exactly the type of response you would want your body to make if you are in the situation of an energy deficit and you have to conserve energy. Now, the investigators weren't completely cruel and heartless, and they gave this guy a break at Thanksgiving and Christmas. And presumably he went out and ate, and you can certainly see over Christmas his weight came up. And notice that his heat production came back up too when he got to eat again. Then they put him back on the diet, weight stays low, heat production comes down. So this is a very nice example of a regulatory response, a homeostatic response. If you're fueling the person with less energy, it makes some sense that his energy expenditure would go down. And you can see how this would be adaptive and allow him to regain weight sooner once he gets access to a bit more food. So that's a very clear regulatory response. If you look at what happens to appetite if you restrict somebody's energy intake, I think it's no mystery. If you don't eat for a whole day, you're pretty hungry by the end of the day. But this was actually studied very systematically in a famous experiment that's usually called the Minnesota starvation experiment. This was run by Ansel Keys and co-workers at the University of Minnesota at the tail end of World War II. And they're interested in finding out what was happening to these victims of concentration camps and people subjected to famine during the war, and specifically also what's the best way to rehabilitate these people nutritionally. So what they did is they took 36 healthy men, and these were conscientious objectors who were able to not be in the military if they contributed in some way, and they cut down the food intake of these people for 24 weeks and made them lose 1/4 of their body weight. And they took very detailed notes and observations of these people to ask, how are they going to respond to this degree of malnutrition? And the surprising thing is that not only were they hungry, their hunger went beyond what you might call hunger, almost to a psychotic food-seeking behavior. They became irrational, obsessed with food. They dreamed about food. They became depressed. One guy even apparently managed to cut 3 of his fingers off in some very delusional state. And so that's a pretty powerful response to food restriction. And of course, all they were thinking about is, give me some food. The other thing is they went into this energy conservation mode, just like Benedict would have predicted. Their heart rates went down, their body temperatures went down, their spontaneous activity went down. And they sort of went into this state of hibernation or torpor characterized by psychotic food cravings. Then as they were refed and they got back to their baseline weight, everything came back to normal. So again, that is the response you would expect your body would make to calorie deprivation. You reduce energy expenditure, you get very, very hungry so that you'll eat more when you get the opportunity. 2 pretty good pieces of evidence that body weight is regulated. But if it's really regulated, it should be regulated against loss of body fat mass as well as gain in body fat mass. And it's a little bit harder to test the response to gain in body fat mass because nobody wants to be made fat necessarily. But Ethan Sims and colleagues in Vermont in the 70s put together a very famous study called the Vermont Study of Experimental Obesity, sometimes called the Vermont Prisoner Study, because their subjects, who supposedly were volunteers, came from the Vermont prison system. And the purpose of this experiment was basically to fatten these normal weight guys up by overfeeding them, and then see what sort of response their body made to that. So this is one of the volunteers from the Sims study who was enrolled in the study as a nice, lean, sort of 20-something-year-old guy at 14.6% body fat. And in the course of the study, they doubled his body fat to 28%. So this is before and this is after. And I think in the middle picture here, you can definitely see that he's got more of an abdomen profile after he's been fattened up. So how did they fatten these people up? Well, it's not easy to do. I don't know if you've ever intentionally tried to make yourself into a mini sumo wrestler or something and really gain some weight. But the way they did this is they paid these guys to overeat. And one of the enduring mysteries of this study, at least to me, is, what's a prisoner do with all this money? We're paying him to eat and eat and eat, and I don't know, I guess they save it for when they get out. But the deal is here, in this particular subject who came in eating a rather small number of calories, under 2,000 calories, he came in at a very steady body weight of just over 70 kilograms. So they start paying this guy literally by the calories that he can eat. And you can see he's capable of this phenomenal increase in what he can eat. I mean, imagine tripling your food intake. No matter how much you like pizza and pretzels or whatever, this is hard to do. And nevertheless, the incentive was strong enough that he was able to do it and to maintain this very high caloric intake, twice or 3 times basal, for quite a number of weeks, 25 weeks here. And what you can see is, as you'd expect, his weight goes up. You overeat, you got to put that energy somewhere, so you put it in your fat. But the key observation here is that in the face of continued overfeeding, significant overfeeding, his weight reaches a plateau and it doesn't get any higher. How can that happen? Well, the only way that can happen is if his energy expenditure went up, basically to burn off the extra calories that were coming in. So just like energy expenditure decreases if you lose weight, it increases if you gain weight, or more precisely, if you gain body fat. Then they stop paying this guy, and look at this. He doesn't even want to look at food. He has seen enough pizza and pretzels, right? He becomes totally satiated, totally anorexic, starts losing weight, and his appetite doesn't really return until he's gone back to his baseline weight. Okay, pretty impressive. Pretty impressive that you could do this in a person in the first place. It's pretty easy to do in laboratory animals. But this is also very good evidence that body weight is regulated both against excessive loss and excessive gain. So if you want to summarize all of these observations in a nice little graph, I think this is the key concept here, which is that fat mass reaches equilibrium when your energy intake equals your energy expenditure. So if you normally defend a body fat mass of 20% without any effort on your part, you're just cruising along, eating what you want to eat, doing what you want to do, and then somebody starts to starve you, or you get sick and you can't eat, and then you get better and you can eat again, what's going to happen after you've lost, say, 5% of your body fat or more is that you're going to come back with a big appetite and lower energy expenditure. So you're going to be in positive energy balance, and that's going to push you back to this point of equilibrium. Conversely, if you are overfed, like they did in Vermont, you are going to get sick of food. You're going to have a very robust increase in satiety. Your energy expenditure is going to go up. You're going to go into negative energy balance and go back to where you started. So this is a very nice system, and it explains why it's hard, at least in the short term, to change your body weight and your body fat. And my own personal experience with this is growing up as a kid in Florida, where it was very hot, and I was a skinny little kid. I really looked wimpy, still do, but it was even worse then, I can guarantee you. And we'd play in phys ed, we'd play different sports, and to differentiate the teams, the coach would always make one of us be shirts, one of us be skins. One wore the shirts, one took the shirts off. And I'd always be sitting there saying, oh, please, don't let it be me, don't let it be me. Don't make me take off my shirt, because I was all bones and stuff. And sure enough, it was usually me. So I decided, okay, I got to bulk up a little bit. So I went on an eating binge and tried to eat as much as I possibly could to fatten myself up. Was I successful? No, not at all. So much as it seems implausible, you can't necessarily easily make yourself fat. Just like it's hard to keep your weight low by restricting your food intake. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, all these concepts were developed in normal weight volunteers. And that's true, but back in the 90s, actually a study here that took Weigle and Hirsch almost a decade to complete was published in 1995. They did these same experiments to obese individuals. And guess what? Obese individuals regulate their body weight too. It's just that to reach this point of equilibrium, they have to store more fat in their body. Once they get to this storage of fat, and we're going to talk about how they get there, they regulate their body weight just as well at that high fat mass as the skinny kid does at the low fat mass. So the good news here is that if you weigh 220 pounds, it would be hard for you to get up to 250 pounds, at least in the short term. If somebody started making you heavy, you'd come back down. The bad side is that if your doctor says, okay, you got to go on a diet and lose weight. I want you to come back in my office when you weigh 190 pounds. Well, that's not going to be very successful because energy intake and energy expenditure will change to restore that equilibrium. And so if you look at virtually any good study that's been done with long follow-up of the outcome of calorie-restricted diets, what you see is that they eventually fail. If all you do is tell somebody, don't eat so much, and you give them some behavioral counseling and all that, sure, they lose weight in the short term, but then if you follow them out for years, what you see is that eventually there's this recidivism, and most people will come back to their baseline weight because body fat mass is regulated. Okay, so that's concept one. Body fat mass is regulated, and it's regulated whether you're obese or non-obese, and that's what makes it hard to change your body fat mass. So you're probably sitting out there saying, wait a minute, this is a molecular medicine talk. Where are the molecules? Well, the molecules didn't come in until about 1990, or in the 1990s. In fact, to be specific, December 1st, 1994, on the cover of the scientific journal Nature, there was an absolute groundbreaking study in which researchers at the Rockefeller University cloned the so-called obese gene. The obese gene had been known to exist for almost 50 years at this point through these mice here. This is called an OB mouse. It's a mouse which spontaneously becomes obese by virtue of a single mutation in a single gene, and these guys are siblings. It's a recessive gene, so 1 out of 4 of the offspring of heterozygous OB parents will be obese like this. And the researchers at Rockefeller went out and, using positional techniques, cloned that gene that is responsible for these animals becoming obese. And they actually behave a lot like obese humans. They eat constantly, they don't move a whole lot, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was one gene that was doing it. So what the researchers found is the sequence of a gene that is now called leptin, leptos from the Greek word meaning thin. And the remarkable thing about this protein is that it's very highly conserved across various species, rat, mouse, human, and this is the amino acid sequence laid out in single letter code. And that suggests that this is a pretty important protein that's doing something very critical to regulating the body weight of these animals. And just because it's kind of hard to say, I know what leptin looks like if you look at a string of letters, here's what leptin looks like if you look at the ribbon structure from crystallography. And it's still hard to know what this looks like. But basically, the key points about leptin are that it's, I think it's about 167 amino acids long, and it's made only in fat. Okay, so this is starting to look very suspicious, isn't it? We've got a single gene which, when knocked out in an animal, makes the animal fat, and that gene is expressed only in fat tissue. If you look more closely at the sequence, you see that the leader sequence of this protein targets it for secretion from the cell. So even before the experiments were done, it seemed like a very likely hypothesis that leptin might be a molecule made by fat cells and secreted by fat into the bloodstream, where it could circulate to the brain and moderate eating behavior. And in 1995, the Zymogenetics company, one of our good partners downtown here, got interested in this project, and they were able to produce some leptin. And my group and I were able to get our hands on this material, and we started injecting it into OB mice to see what would happen. And sure enough, if you look at the top graph here, you have the weight of the animal on the left axis, the left y-axis, and the weight of the food the animal's eating on the right y-axis. And what we're doing here is just injecting the animal with leptin into the peritoneum every day, a single injection of leptin, and that entered the bloodstream and it got circulated around to where it had access to the brain. And you can see that when we were giving leptin, this animal dropped its food intake very dramatically and dropped its weight correspondingly. Of course, you have to do a control experiment anytime you do a real experiment. This is the control where we were injecting the animals just with saline to prove that we weren't just bothering them so badly that they lost weight. And sure enough, leptin had this predicted effect that you might expect a hormone produced by fat tissue to have. So the model that became very quickly adopted to explain at least the very basic existence of body fat regulation is this here. Your brain is what's in charge of appetite and behavior. Your brain tells you when you're hungry, tells you it's time to eat, tells you when to stop eating. So your brain says, hey, I'm hungry, let's eat. You're going to take in some food, and your brain also determines how much energy you're going to expend, both involuntarily and voluntarily. And if you start taking in more food than you need at that time, it's going to be stored as fat. Fat tissue, in turn, makes leptin, and other things are made as well. And this signal comes out of the fat, and it serves as a marker for how much fat is out there. It's proportional to the body fat mass. And that signal feeds back to the brain, and when the body fat is what's appropriate for your particular genotype, the brain says, okay, enough to eat, we'll just go back to eating regular amounts, and you stop depositing fat. So this is a very nice negative feedback loop, almost like the feedback between the heat in your room and the thermostat in your furnace. If you lose too much fat, the leptin signal goes down. The brain says, ha, not enough fat out there, let's eat some more. And sure enough, your food intake goes up and you re-regulate. So at least at its very simplest level, this appears to be one of the key molecular events in body weight regulation. And just a tremendous amount of research over the past 15 years has gone into how leptin's produced, how it acts on the brain, and we know a huge amount about how leptin acts in the brain now, and I'm going to spare you most of this because it gets pretty detailed, but this is a rat's brain cut across in frontal section, and the action areas for leptin to do its stuff, its thing, are down here in the hypothalamus. The arcuate nucleus, shown in red, the lateral hypothalamus, shown in green. And these are the centers that are directly responsible for your appetite, your food-seeking behavior, your energy expenditure, and this is where you find the leptin receptor, monitoring how much fat is in your body. So again, you're going to say, wait a minute, this is just mice and rats. What about people? Well, it works in people too. This is a very famous picture that appeared in the journals back in 2002, and this is a leptin-deficient human. He's one of a very inbred set of siblings from a consanguineous marriage in a family that was in Pakistan. And here, as something like a 10-year-old kid, I believe, without any treatment, you can see he's got a pretty good amount of body fat. And he was found genetically to lack a functional leptin molecule. And when leptin was injected into this guy, you can see that it does exactly what the model would say. It says to the brain, okay, I do have enough fat after all, and so you can stop eating now, and he loses weight. Okay, so there's now a very nice molecular mechanism underpinning at least the basics of body weight regulation. And so let's acknowledge, however, that really only a tiny minority of people, something like, I think it's up to 18 or 20 now, have been discovered who actually have leptin deficiency. It certainly doesn't explain the obesity epidemic. So to understand a little bit more about the obesity epidemic, we have to go to an experiment of nature. And this is a very provocative set of observations that I'm sure some of you have heard about, and it has to do with a Native American group called the Pima, which was a group of people that originated and lived in the southwest of the United States and northern Mexico in the region of the Gila River. And now many of these people live on the Gila Reservation. And historically, the Pima, before industrialization of the American Southwest, were an agricultural people. They're barely able to kind of get their living out of the dry desert soil by diverting water from the Gila River and irrigating the land and growing crops and eating very low on the food chain and working very hard to get this food. And so you can imagine that you didn't see very many obese Pima before industrialization hit the Southwest. And sure enough, here's a Pima gentleman standing beside his house. This was an article in Geographic in '67. This picture is actually taken many years before that. And this guy certainly doesn't have an obesity problem. And the Pima nowadays who live in northern Mexico and still have a fairly agricultural existence don't have much of an obesity problem either. But look at what's happened to almost every single one of the Pima folks who now live in Arizona, where now there's 7-Elevens and McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chickens and pickup trucks, and you certainly don't have to dig ditches to grow your crops. What's happened to these folks is they've become almost uniformly obese. All of them. Very high prevalence rate of obesity. And not only is that true in individuals, it's true across the generations. Grandmother, mother, son, all very obese. So what is this telling us, this experiment of nature? Well, it's telling us two things. It's telling us that the environment has a very strong impact on how much fat you're going to store in your body. But also, it's telling you that your genes play an important part too, because look at how uniform this response is. The uniformity of response in this population of unrelated individuals, other than their general ethnic group, tells you that they must have inherited the predisposition that allowed them to become obese when they're put in the correct environment. Okay? So the conclusion is obesity has both a genetic and an environmental component. And I think maybe the best way to think about this now is the genes specify how susceptible you're going to be to obesity if you've got the opportunity to become obese. Namely, you've got lots of food and you don't have to work very hard to get it. So to talk about the genetic component first, this is the human brain now. I've shown you a rat's brain, and here's the hypothalamus of the human, the bottom part of the brain here. It's the part of the brain that's controlling all your sort of involuntary functions, your breathing, your body temperature, your eating, your drinking. And if you want to start getting a feel for the detail at which this is understood now, we know that in the hypothalamus there are two classes of neurons in the arcuate nucleus. One of them that makes the neurotransmitter NPY is the hunger neurons. One of them that makes the neurotransmitter POMC is the anorexia neurons. And these neurons in the base of your brain are getting information on how much leptin is in your blood, which is in turn telling how much fat is in your body, how much insulin is in your blood, which also tells you how much fat is in your body. And then there's this kind of weird anti-leptin hormone called ghrelin, which we're not going to talk about. But basically, these neurons in the brain are monitoring your body fat content by looking at these hormones. And if you lose weight, leptin levels go down. The negative feedback of leptin on the hunger system is relieved. You ship a lot of NPY into a more anterior part of the brain called the paraventricular nucleus. And basically, the hunger system wins over the satiety system, and you eat. If, on the other hand, you're overfed, and the leptin signal goes up, it turns off the hunger system, turns on the satiety system, or the anorexia system, using this neurotransmitter called alpha-MSH, and this side of the picture becomes dominant. So there's this kind of yin-yang seesaw system in your brain that's making you either hungry or full, depending on how much fat is out there. So when we talk about the genetic contribution to obesity, what we're talking about is the huge number of polymorphisms which can exist in all of these genes, right? Every gene can have a certain number of mutations. Some of them will be very critical mutations that actually knock out the gene, like leptin-deficient mutations. Some of them might be more subtle and might do something like diminish the affinity of the melanocortin-4 receptor for alpha-MSH. And you can imagine that depending on your ethnic group or just the luck of the draw, you might inherit sets of genes that make the hunger system maybe a little bit more dominant over the anorexia system, and that might be sufficient to predispose you to obesity if you can get your hands on food. And this isn't just hypothetical. This is now being shown very clearly, and it turns out probably on a day-to-day basis the most important system for regulating your body weight is the anorexia system, and that's shown here by two brothers. These are both brothers, and they're roughly 16 years old. This brother here inherited a complete knockout of the melanocortin-4 receptor gene, and you can see he's very obese because he's basically lost his satiety system. Doesn't matter how much body fat and how much leptin he makes, he's always hungry and he deposits fat. This guy is in the same house, eating the same stuff, presumably, and he's nice and thin because he has a functional system. And so it turns out that unlike leptin deficiency, this particular genetic deficiency accounts for probably 5% of very extreme obesity in humans. And it looks like lesser degrees of that receptor disorder cause lesser degrees of obesity, but still set you up for obesity. So basically, the wiring of your brain and how it responds to the message coming in from fat determines how susceptible you're going to be. And of course, this opportunity hasn't been lost on the drug companies, and there are dozens of biotech companies and drug companies out there all over the world trying to come up with drugs which are going to tweak this system to favor satiety and diminish hunger. And so there are only, 5 or 6 drug targets listed here. You know, you could imagine making a drug that mimics leptin, or you could imagine making a drug that inhibits NPY. And there's this huge financial incentive, of course, to be the company that comes up with the drug which is going to fix this problem. And you'll notice you haven't read any newspaper headlines of miracle drug treats obesity. And that's because this is a highly redundant system. The likelihood that we're going to find one drug that totally changes its operation is not very high. I don't think that's going to happen. And even if it did happen, knowing our economic system, it would be priced so high that nobody could get it. So, and then finally, if we've got, 120 million overweight, obese people in this country now, closer to 150 million, you're not going to treat 2/3 of any population with a drug. So even though the genetics are what's making this problem bad in many ways, I think we have to turn to the environment to look for the solutions in the long term to obesity. So what are the environmental things that interact with the regulatory system to make us obese? Well, I think you're aware of most of these. One thing is basically food tastes too good now, okay? And that's not an accident, right? Big food companies aren't going to make money by making bad tasting food. So we're making food very attractive, and we'll talk about the similarity between eating good tasting food and drug seeking behavior in a minute here. We have a lot of fat in our diet. So food tastes good, it's got a lot of fat, and fat is really high in energy, and that makes it easy to overeat. It's got a lot of fructose. Fructose is also high in energy, and in fact our fructose consumption, particularly in sweetened drinks, has really increased in recent years. We're eating way more at every meal than we ever used to eat. And we also tend to work a lot less. You know, computers and video games don't do much to increase your fitness level. So I think these are the factors we're all aware of as potential causes or contributors to obesity. And just how bad is that situation now? Well, this is a nice graph of what's happened to food portion size in so-called fast foods or snack foods from 1977 to 1998. This is a nice study showing, good study showing bad news, basically, showing us that virtually everything that we consider sort of, at least the stuff I like to eat, we've started eating larger and larger portions as time goes on. And a lot of these foods are either high in fructose, which contributes a lot of energy, or they're high in fat, cheeseburgers, hamburgers, whatever. And so portion size may be able to push cumulatively your regulated body fat mass into a higher level. And thanks to Holly Callahan, who gave me these slides earlier. Holly's our nutritional scientist in the Clinical Research Center. You can see just what's happened to portion sizes, okay? Bagels, if you can remember 20 years ago, were not enormous pieces of food. But you go to the typical bagel store now, and they're almost the size of a dinner plate. So bagels have gotten big. Cheeseburgers have gotten big. And there's just, 20 foods or so that are in this particular slideshow, all of which have become much bigger over time. So portion size, along with the palatability of food, seems to be able to alter the point at which we regulate. And sedentary behaviors, absolutely on the increase. Lots of studies in particular on what television is doing to kids and adults too. And this is a pedometer study of about 500 minority adult residents in low-income housing. They wore pedometers, and you could correlate hours of TV watching with steps that they took. And first of all, there's this incredible amount of TV people watch. I just can't imagine how you could watch that much TV. And for every hour of TV you view, you take 144 less steps per day. And the chance that you'll actually hit 10,000 steps per day, which is a commonly recommended step or prescription when we use pedometers in treating obesity, the chance that you're going to hit that number of steps decreases by 16% per hour of television viewed. So how can we reconcile these environmental factors with the regulatory system? And that's what's getting the most research in the field of obesity now. And just to summarize what we know about this, these environmental factors hijack the brain regulatory system. And they do it in ways that you can demonstrate very nicely in animals. It's a little harder to demonstrate in people. But if you take an adult rat and feed it a high-fat diet and then give it an injection of leptin, you'll find that the leptin has less ability to turn that animal's appetite down if it's been preceded by a high-fat diet. Or if you take an adult animal and make that animal sedentary, put it in a very confined cage, and you compare it to animals that have wheels to run on, and you ask what effect an injection of leptin has on that animal, the animal that's been exercising shuts down its eating much more vigorously in response to leptin than the sedentary animal. So in adults, it looks like the regulatory system is sort of deflected, if you will, by some of the bad things coming at us in the environment. Even more scary is that if this is happening to a pregnant animal, it actually can rewire the brain of the fetus so that that fetus becomes an adult expecting to have a higher body fat content than the animals born to mother rats that aren't given high-fat food, for example. So very frightening, and I think it's borne out in humans by the childhood obesity epidemic. If you're the product of a pregnancy from a woman who's eating too much or too much fat, that can predispose you to fat. And then finally, it's very clear now from PET scans and all sorts of things that food, particularly good tasting food, activates the same centers in the brain that drugs of addiction do. And there's a lot of work going in now to how addictive stimuli can change the operating point of this system. So it's true to say that regulation still exists, but that the point of regulation is being moved in some bad directions by environmental factors. So what can we do about this? Well, one thing you might say is, can we change what we eat to fool our brain into thinking that there's more fat out there and therefore regulate fat at a lower level? We already know that just telling people to eat less doesn't work very well. But what if we tell them to eat something a little bit different? And so probably the most successful commercial attempt that's ever run in this direction is the Atkins diet. What happens if we really take carbohydrate out of the diet? Or the Ornish diet, what happens if we really take fat out of the diet? Will that change the way our brain perceives our body fat mass and allow us to lose weight? And just to remind each other, your diet consists of some mixture of protein, carbohydrate, and fat. So a lot of effort has gone into seeing the effect of dietary modification of these macronutrients on what happens. And Holly Callahan, who I mentioned earlier, and I and a bunch of coworkers have done several of these studies at the University of Washington. And interestingly, what you find is that if you do reduce dietary fat by 20% and replace it by carbohydrate, and you start letting people eat that diet freely at this point, they voluntarily choose to eat less. And as a result, they start losing weight. So you can, it appears, trick the brain into re-regulating at a lower level if you do this. And if you do it instead by replacing dietary fat with high protein, you get an even bigger effect. And that's actually shown here. When we ran these studies over the course of 4 months, if we made the diet high in carb, low in fat, people lost 3.7 kilograms. If we made it high in protein and low in fat, they lost even more. And even though this wasn't quite significant, if you look at what how much they decreased their caloric intake, you can see that if people are eating a lot of protein, it tends to result in greater satiety. And there's a whole field of research growing up in this area, and an investigator named Randy Seeley is going to be coming out to the university later in the month, and he has a lot to say about this if you're interested. So at least in the short term, it does look like you can change the regulatory point by changing the macronutrients. The disappointing news is that in the long term, the studies are about equally split between studies showing that you can create sustained weight loss and studies showing that you really can't with these diets. So I think the problem in people is very complex, related to things like food satisfaction, social stresses, and so forth. So finally, just to wrap up, where is the money? Where's the big payoff going to be in approaching the obesity epidemic, this plague of the 21st century? And I think the field in general pretty well agrees that extensive community interventions are what's going to get us where we want to go in combating the rise of obesity. So just like the saying goes, it takes a village. It takes a big change in the infrastructure and in the social structure to reduce these environmental factors that take our genetic predisposition to obesity and make it manifest. And probably the best study that's been published recently is not one village, but a 2-village study in France, I guess Fleurbault-Levant, I don't quite know how you say that, but these are 2 towns in France that, starting in 2000, decided they were going to make a concerted public effort to limit obesity. And they did that by basically having every person, every adult in the village give thought to how they could educate children in the proper things to eat, how they could get more activity. They built playgrounds, they built walking trails, they created sports programs. They gave huge media coverage to this experiment, something like 200 newspaper articles, 75 radio shows, 25 television shows, and by basically refocusing these whole communities on healthful behaviors, they showed that over the course of 5 years, they could dramatically reduce the incidence of childhood overweight and obesity in both boys and girls. And compared to the neighboring towns shown in the white bars, the intervention towns, the FVLS towns, had only an 8.8% net rate of obesity by the end of 5 years, as compared to a 17.8% in the neighboring towns. And this was somewhat affected by the sort of the social class of the population. So the bottom line is, if we're going to make a dent in the obesity epidemic, it's going to take a very concerted change in the infrastructure. So just to wrap it up, body fat mass is regulated in part by leptin. That's the satiety signal, which goes to the brain. But there's genetic variation in the action of leptin in the brain that can set you up to become obese. And then, depending on how susceptible you are, environmental factors related to your diet and activity level can promote obesity by kind of interacting with these leptin-sensitive circuits and making you re-regulate at a higher level. So ultimately, control of obesity is going to require both efforts on the individual basis and on society to reduce those risk factors. And yes, there are no simple solutions to obesity, but we will get there eventually. So thank you for your attention.